Hi, this is David Hildebrand. This is going to be a lecture on John Dewey's Chapter 7 of his book Reconstruction in Philosophy. This chapter is entitled Reconstruction in Moral Conceptions. Now, in this chapter, Dewey is building on work that he's done in previous chapters, where he discussed changes in scientific thinking and logical thinking and epistemological thinking and how to reconstruct those changes. And Dewey argues that the changes that he's discussed in terms of logic and science and epistemology all have a direct bearing on the way we think of moral conceptions and moral philosophy. Moral rules, moral ends, moral goods all need to be reconstructed, Dewey argues. They need to be reconstructed from older views, which posited universal, fixed conceptions which were grounded in a single cause or in a single reality. They need to be reconstructed towards an account of morality which is situational, which is perspectival, which is capable of a range of flexible functions and functions which are not just willy-nilly but are stabilized by multiple causes, by multiple kinds of experience. So in this chapter, Dewey does what he does in other places, which he gives a kind of genealogy, a historical diagnosis of how we got to the present point. And he begins, as he does elsewhere, with a look at the ancient Greeks. Now, the Greeks substituted reason for custom, and they thought that this was an advance in the management of moral life. Why? Well, because it made morality less provincial, less variable, less based on time and place, and, importantly, less trapped in custom, whatever custom you happen to find yourself inheriting. But Dewey notes about this move that the substitution of reason for custom doesn't make the binding metric any more flexible or any less eternal. Reason is, after all, one unchanging, universal, transcendent standard. And there's no change then in the basic ontic structure of Greek philosophy, Greek metaphysics, that's affected by moral theory. So in Dewey's view, this failure of the Greeks to make a significant change in how we think about moral life and moral theorizing is part of a longer-term upshot, a general penchant for monocausal theorizing in ethics that runs through the centuries. So, in general, the typical approach to moral theories, right, considered as sort of a mass group, is that they seek a single, final, ultimate cause for morality. That could mean an ultimate justification for our laws of conduct. It could mean some final source of right and wrong. That could be divine will. It could be the king. It could be the church. It could be rationality in general. Right? It could also mean some single good or end, which has to be pursued based on what's right, or that's proposed as what's right. So one's true self, one's self-realization, one's holiness, right? A pursuit of holiness, or a pursuit of happiness, or a pursuit of the greatest pleasure, right? Or the greatest pleasure, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Right? So all of these approaches share something in common, Dewey argues, that they have a sort of single goal or a single explanation behind their moral theory. And this is what needs to be questioned, he argues. Right? It's not a question of which moral theory is correct, right? As if we could tweak one or tweak another or choose one or choose another. They all share this common monocausal goal. So Dewey's reconstruction of morality begins with a different picture of the world, of experience and reality. Right? This is a picture which is no longer feudal, right? F-E-U-D-A-L, feudal, where change was associated with being a worker or low class, while what was eternal, what was unchanging, was associated with the noble or with the nobility. Instead, Dewey says, let's apply a sort of scientific way of thinking, scientific conceptions to morality. And if we do, we'll see that moral problems become situational, they become multi-centered, they become individualized. And there happens to be now, in this picture, a range of goods and purposes which are at stake in morality. Now, problems seen in these ways, in these sort of scientific ways, require inquiry. And so a big part of Dewey's ethics is taken up with moral inquiry. And moral inquiry proceeds much in the same ways that scientific inquiries proceed. Right? It proceeds experimentally. It proceeds with an eye to specific goals or solutions. It proceeds with the idea that methods are going to be validated based on future outcomes, based on future experiences. Now, this is a major change for morality. This is a major reorientation of moral theory. Because on Dewey's approach, one has to search. They have to search for the meaning that's encountered in a moral situation. Moral meanings are not subordinate, right? They don't subordinate particular cases to eternal principles. So the idea is that you don't take a particular case and find the moral theory or moral principle that it fits underneath, right? Rather, a moral inquiry searches for the practical meanings that are at stake in, say, a conflict of desires or a conflict between different goods, between apparently equal goods, but maybe on investigation they're not equal. Right? It has to be inquired into. So what one does in moral inquiry is to apply what's been called elsewhere the pragmatic rule. And this means that moral meaning has to be discovered. It has to be discovered by locating it in a specific situation. One has to evaluate that meaning with an eye that anticipates, that looks prospectively at the consequences for experience and doesn't look retrospectively or transcendentally, right, at fixed principles, right? Am I living up to the fixed principles, right? How should I interpret my experience? What are the fixed principles, right? Now, such moral situations arise in our lives, in our experience. And to deal with them, moral inquiry is best accomplished with this empirical, experimental, intelligent approach. That means that observations have to be detailed. There has to be clarification done of elements that are obscure. You have to try to weigh what's important from what's unimportant in the course of inquiry. You have to trace out different possible consequences. And there has to be a disciplined and hypothetical treatment of possible decisions that wait until they can be tested, right? You don't want to jump the gun. You don't want to assume that you've come upon a solution without testing it. So what's the upshot of this? What is the cost of this to traditional ethical approaches? Well, there's a loss of eternal truths. There's a loss of fixed definitions and fixed certain kinds of moral elements, right? Goods, ends, virtues, vices, character, right? Well, what's the benefit then? Well, the benefit to ethics is that there's a growth of facts. There's a growth in terms of like laws and classifications understood hypothetically, the way you might understand a scientific law. There's an increased ability to deal with life's specific problems, right? There's power in the constructive sense of being able to solve problems. This approach to ethics has additional benefits too. For example, for the sciences. The sciences are humanized by this approach to ethics. And you might think about James's approaches in pragmatism to try to humanize science, right? To make it play nicer with religion and with spirituality and spiritual beliefs. Dewey notes that the technical character of the sciences in effect came from their bringing techniques to bear on problems, but not necessarily because they had any sort of permanent purchase on reality. Another benefit from this approach has to do with our sense of what a moral failure is, right? A moral failure is no longer a sin or the wrong rational object. Rather, a moral failure turns out to be a deficiency in our habit, in our way of going about things. You could call these things virtues if you like, but there are certain ways of going about things or virtues that are needed for good and competent inquiry. They might include, to be sympathetic, to be careful, right? Or to be impartial in judgment as you proceed an inquiry. And so these are all good qualities, and the opposite of them, right, the absence of sympathy or carelessness or perverse bias in judgment, are the same kinds of failures that affect bad scientists. Right, so a biased scientist is not a very good scientist, and a partial scientist or an unsympathetic scientist is not a very good scientist. Right? So another benefit is it changes our views about what an end is or what a good is in morality. There's no longer an assumption that there is some single good, some summum bonum, but multiple goods, right, are possible. There are also a plurality of goods and ends in morality, just as there could be, right, for example, multiple natural goods. You might think, well, health is a good, and wealth is a good, friendship is a good, right? You could think of multiple moral goods, right? Justice is a good, benevolence is a good, moderation is a good. So we realize by thinking this way that the goods that we classify as, say, natural goods or moral goods are not really categorically different. They're functional distinctions that help us in moral inquiry, right? So just as in science, all conceptions are useful if they direct our inquiry, if they're directing conceptions, as he says in another book. I think it's Logic, the Theory of Inquiry. Another thing that's abolished in this realm is the distinction between intrinsic goods and instrumental goods or ends. Right? Those are functional distinctions at most. What an end or good is not a thing, but it's a direction of process. Right? So an end can grow. What we aim for can evolve, in other words. Standards can evolve. We can get better at judging means and ends. And indeed, we often find ourselves to work at improving our standards and improving our ideals. So it's not as if there's no chance of improvement, but we don't have some ultimate standard towards which to improve, right? So finally, another way that this can benefit us in the moral arena is how we judge one another, right? Now, what counts as character is no longer about some person's, the stamp on them or the mold of their personality. Character is about judging the direction of growth. So a good person is not good or bad in terms of their intrinsic nature. A good person is someone who is moving in a better direction, moving in a direction of growth.